The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning wood and flesh as the armies of Cyrus the Great surged toward the gates of Babylon. The sun hung low in the sky, its light a blood-red haze that cast long shadows across the battlefield. Dust and smoke mingled with the screams of the dying, creating a symphony of chaos that seemed to echo from the very depths of the earth. This was the third war between Babylon and Persia, and it was unlike any that had come before. Cyrus, ever the conqueror, had poured the full might of his empire into this assault, determined to finally break the city that had defied him for so long. His armies had marched through the desert like an unstoppable tide, their numbers vast and seemingly endless, each soldier driven by the will of their king. But Cyrus, for all his ambition, had underestimated the forces he had unleashed. The dragons, ancient and terrible, were not creatures that could be controlled by mere mortals, not even by a king as powerful as Cyrus. And now, as the battle raged and the flames of the dragons consumed all in their path, Cyrus began to realize the true cost of his alliance with the dark sorceress Nemesis. The battle begins. The first wave of the Persian assault crashed against the walls of Babylon like a storm. The cavalry and infantry, their armor gleaming in the dying light, charged forward with a ferocity that matched the fury of their king. Spears and swords clashed, arrows rained down from the battlements, and the ground shook with the force of the fighting. The Babylonians, hardened by years of warfare, met the assault with equal determination. Their soldiers, clad in dark armor and armed with spears and shields, stood firm against the onslaught, their resolve unbroken despite the overwhelming numbers of their enemy. The gates of the city, reinforced with iron and stone, held strong against the battering rams, refusing to yield to the relentless attacks of the Persian soldiers. But even as the battle raged at the walls, a new threat emerged from the skies. Zuhalu, the leader of the dragons, appeared first, his massive form blotting out the sun as he descended from the heavens. His scales, black as obsidian, shimmered with an eerie light as he flew low over the battlefield, his eyes burning with a fire that reflected the anger and sorrow he carried within him. Behind him, 3 other dragons followed, their wings beating the air with a sound like thunder. As they approached the battlefield, Zuhalu let out a roar that shook the earth, a sound so powerful that it caused the fighting to pause for a moment, as both armies looked up in awe and fear. And then, with a single, mighty breath, Zuhalu unleashed a torrent of flame that engulfed the Persian and Babylonian soldiers alike. The fire was unlike any that the world had seen before. It was not the simple, red fire of mortal flames, but something far more terrible, a fire that burned with the intensity of the sun, a fire that consumed everything in its path. The ground beneath the soldiers turned to molten glass, their armor melted like wax, and their flesh was incinerated in an instant. Screams of agony filled the air as the flames spread, turning the battlefield into a hellscape of ash and smoke. Zuhalu's brethren followed his lead, their flames scorching the earth as they swooped low over the city, their breath turning the stone walls to slag, reducing homes to rubble, and leaving nothing but devastation in their wake. The once mighty armies of Cyrus and the defenders of Babylon were caught in the inferno, their ranks decimated by the uncontrollable power of the dragons. The fury of Cyrus. Cyrus the Great stood on a hill overlooking the battlefield, his face twisted in rage as he watched his soldiers burn. His hands clenched into fists, the tendons standing out starkly against his skin, as the realization dawned on him that the dragons, his supposed allies, had turned their fury on his own men. He turned to Nemesis, who stood beside him, her violet eyes gleaming with a cold, detached amusement as she observed the destruction below. "What is this?" Cyrus roared, his voice thick with fury. "You said the dragons would aid us. You promised victory, not this slaughter." Nemesis met his gaze with a calmness that only served to further infuriate the king. "This is war, Cyrus," she said, her voice smooth and unyielding. "Collateral damage is inevitable. The dragon's fire is indiscriminate, yes, but it is also a force of nature. It will consume all in its path, and in the end, Babylon will fall." Cyrus's eyes blazed with anger. "You did not tell me they would burn my own men alive. I will not have my army destroyed by these beasts." Nemesis' smile was cold, a mere tightening of the lips. "You wanted power, Cyrus. I have given it to you. But power comes with a price, one that you must be willing to pay. The dragons will destroy Babylon, and if that means sacrificing some of your soldiers in the process, then so be it. Victory will be yours, as I promised. Cyrus felt a chill run down his spine at her words, the realization that he had bound himself to a force far more dangerous than he had anticipated. But there was no turning back now. The battle was already in motion, and he could not afford to show weakness. Very well, Cyrus said through gritted teeth, forcing his anger down. But if you cannot control them, if they turn on us completely, I will hold you personally responsible, Ninmagus. Ninmagus inclined her head, her expression unreadable. You have nothing to fear, my king. The dragons will do as I command. Their fire will be the key to your victory. But as she spoke, Cyrus could not shake the feeling that he had unleashed something far beyond his control, something that could destroy not just Babylon, but everything he had worked so hard to build. The struggle for survival. On the ground, the battle between the Persian and Babylonian soldiers raged on, even as the dragons unleashed their fiery wrath from above. The soldiers fought with a desperation born of fear, their weapons clashing in a deadly dance as they tried to survive the onslaught. The Babylonians, their backs against the walls of their city, fought with a ferocity that belied their dwindling numbers. They knew that if Babylon fell, their people would be slaughtered, their city reduced to ash. They had seen the power of the dragons, had witnessed their flames turn stone to liquid and metal to slag, and yet they fought on, determined to protect their home at all costs. The Persians, meanwhile, struggled to maintain their ranks in the face of the dragons' fire. Their once proud cavalry, the backbone of Cyrus's army, had been decimated by the initial blast, their horses reduced to charred skeletons, their riders burned beyond recognition. The infantry, too, had suffered heavy losses, their armor melting in the heat, their bodies consumed by the flames. But they pressed on, driven by the will of their king, by the promise of glory and conquest. Amidst the chaos, Ira stood on the walls of Babylon, his eyes fixed on the dragons as they circled above, their flames lighting up the night sky. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as he tightened his grip on the hilt of the Blazefrost celestial sword. He had faced many foes in his time, had battled against the mightiest of warriors, but the dragons were something else entirely, a force of nature, unstoppable and all-consuming. Their fire was a power that even he struggled to comprehend, a power that threatened to destroy everything he had fought to protect. As the dragons swooped low over the city, their flames scorching the earth, Ira knew he had to act. He raised the Blazefrost celestial sword high above his head, the blade gleaming with a cold, blue light that seemed to cut through the darkness. With a single, fluid motion, he swung the sword toward the oncoming flames, unleashing a wave of icy wind that collided with the dragon's fire. The cold wind howled through the streets of Babylon, freezing the flames in their tracks, turning the molten stone to solid ice, the burning wood to brittle frost. The temperature dropped sharply, the air filling with the sound of crackling ice as the fire was extinguished by the sword's power. But even as Ira wielded the Blazefrost celestial sword, he could feel the strain on his body, the cold seeping into his bones, numbing his fingers and toes. The power of the sword was immense, but it came at a cost that was slowly draining him of his strength, of his very life force. And worse, the ice that froze the flames also claimed the lives of the Babylonian soldiers caught in the path of the battle. Men who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Ira in defense of their city were turned to statues of frost, their bodies locked in eternal struggle as the cold consumed them. Ira's heart sank as he realized the unintended consequences of his actions. He had stopped the dragon's fire from spreading further into the city, but at the cost of countless lives. The very people he had sworn to protect had fallen victim to his own power, and the weight of that guilt bore down on him like a crushing tide. The dragons, undeterred by the icy winds, roared in fury as they flew over the city, their flames reduced but not extinguished. The dragon's wrath. The roar of the dragons echoed across Babylon, a sound so primal and terrifying that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the city. Their flames, though momentarily tempered by Ira's sword, still burned with an intensity that defied comprehension. The streets of Babylon, once bustling with life, were now a scene of utter devastation. Buildings crumbled under the weight of the dragon's onslaught, their stone walls reduced to rubble as the fire spread through the city like a living thing, consuming all in its path. Zuhalu, leading the charge, circled above the city like a vengeful spirit, his eyes locked on Ira. The great dragon's heart was a storm of conflicting emotions, rage for the loss of his brother Dracula, hatred for the gods who had allowed it to happen, and a deep, gnawing sorrow that had never left him since that fateful day. But beneath it all, there was also a sense of duty, a belief that by unleashing his fury on Babylon, he was somehow honoring Dracula's memory, avenging his death in the only way he knew how. He dove toward the city, his wings slicing through the air as he opened his jaws and unleashed another torrent of flame. The fire poured from his mouth in a great wave, washing over the rooftops and alleyways, setting the night ablaze. The screams of the city's inhabitants filled the air as they fled in terror, seeking refuge from the inferno that seemed to come from every direction. Ira, standing atop the city walls, watched in horror as the flames spread, his mind racing to find a way to stop the destruction. The Blazefrost celestial sword pulsed in his hand, the blade glowing with a cold, blue light that promised power beyond imagination, but also carried with it the weight of unimaginable responsibility. He knew he had to act, to do something to stop the dragons before they reduced Babylon to ashes. But he also knew that every time he used the sword's power, it came at a cost not just to himself, but to those around him. With a deep breath, Ira raised the sword once more, the blade humming with energy as he focused his thoughts, his will, on the task at hand. The cold wind began to swirl around him, a vortex of icy air that grew in strength as he channeled the power of the sword. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, numbing his fingers and toes, but he pushed the sensation aside, focusing instead on the flames that raged below. With a single, decisive motion, Ira brought the sword down, unleashing a wave of cold that swept across the city. The air froze in an instant, the temperature plummeting as the icy wind extinguished the flames, turning the raging inferno into a frozen wasteland. The fire that had once threatened to consume the city was now trapped in ice, its destructive power neutralized by the cold. But the cost was high. As the flames were extinguished, so too were the lives of those caught in the path of the cold. Babylonian soldiers, civilians, even some of Cyrus's men, all were frozen in place, their bodies encased in a layer of frost that turned them into statues, their final moments preserved in chilling clarity. Ira's heart ached as he looked down at the scene before him, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical force. He had saved the city from the dragon's fire, but at what cost? How many lives had he sacrificed in the process? And what right did he have to wield such power, to decide who lived and who died? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden rush of air as Zuhalu swooped down toward him, the dragon's massive form blotting out the sky. Ira barely had time to react before the dragon was upon him, its talons outstretched, its eyes burning with fury. Ira raised the Blazefrost celestial sword just in time, the blade clashing against Zuhalu's talons with a sound like thunder. The impact sent a shockwave through the air, the force of it nearly knocking Ira off his feet. But he held his ground, his grip on the sword firm as he met the dragon's gaze. The battle of ice and fire. The air was thick with the stench of sulfur and smoke, the ground beneath Ira's feet scorched and blackened by the flames that had ravaged the battlefield. The dying light of the sun cast long shadows over the ruins of Babylon, turning the city into a landscape of twisted metal and charred stone. The cries of the wounded and the dying filled the air, mingling with the distant roar of the retreating dragons as they fled into the darkening sky. But Ira heard none of it. His entire world had narrowed to a single, terrible moment, the moment when he had faced the dragon Zuhalu, the leader of the ancient, fearsome creatures that had brought so much death and destruction to the world. The Blazefrost celestial sword was heavy in his hand, its cold fire pulsing with a life of its own, a life that seemed to drain more of Ira's strength with every passing second. His body trembled from exhaustion and pain, the cold seeping into his very bones, numbing his senses and making every movement a struggle. The flames from Zuhalu's breath still clung to his skin, a searing heat that even the sword's power could not fully extinguish. Yet, Even as the ice from the Blaze Frost sword spread across his body, quelling the fire and protecting him from the worst of the dragon's wrath, Ira could feel the burns beneath the surface, the damage done to him by the dragon's attack. He had thrown the Blaze Frost celestial sword with all the strength he could muster, focusing his mind, his will, and his power into that single action. The blade had left his hand in a blur of blue light, its cold fire slicing through the air with deadly precision. But Zuhalu, with the speed and agility that belied his massive size, had twisted away at the last moment, the sword missing him by mere inches before returning to Ira's grasp. Ira had not faltered. He had taken a deep breath, feeling the cold fire of the sword burn through his veins, focusing once more on the dragon before him. He had thrown the sword again, harder this time, with more force, more determination. But once again, Zuhalu had evaded the strike, the blade skimming past him and embedding itself in the ground a few feet away. Ira's heart had sunk. He had been so sure that the Blaze Frost celestial sword was the key to defeating the dragon, to ending the battle and saving Babylon. But with each failed strike, that certainty had wavered, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The sword was powerful, but it was not infallible, and Zuhalu was a creature of ancient, terrifying strength, a creature that had faced gods and men alike, and had survived. But Ira knew he could not give up. He could not let Babylon fall, could not let the people he had sworn to protect be destroyed by this monster. The Blaze Frost celestial sword was his only hope, the only weapon that could stand against the might of the dragon. And so, he had tried again. The dragon had not waited this time. Zuhalu, enraged by the failed attempts on his life, had roared and charged at Ira, his massive body moving with a speed that was almost impossible to comprehend. His jaws had opened wide, and from deep within his throat, a torrent of flame had erupted, a fire so intense, so all-consuming, that it seemed to turn the very air to ash. Ira had no time to react, no time to prepare. The fire washed over him, a wave of heat and destruction that seared his skin, burned his lungs, and threatened to consume him completely. The pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a searing agony that left him gasping for breath, his vision swimming as the world around him turned to fire. But even as the flames engulfed him, the Blaze Frost celestial sword had reacted, the cold fire within it surging to protect its master. A layer of ice had spread across Ira's body, a protective barrier that shielded him from the worst of the flames, cooling the burning skin and soothing the pain. Yet, despite the protection of the sword, Ira had been badly injured. The burns beneath the ice still throbbed with pain, his muscles weak and trembling from the strain. But Ira had refused to fall, had refused to give in to the agony that racked his body. He had pushed through the pain, through the exhaustion, focusing every ounce of his remaining strength on the sword in his hand. He had to try again. He had to end this, once and for all. As the flames died down, as Zuhalu reared back, preparing for another strike, Ira had raised the Blaze Frost celestial sword for the third time. His vision had blurred, his body had trembled, but his mind had been clear, his focus absolute. He had gathered all the power he could muster, all the strength that remained within him, and had poured it into the sword, feeling the cold fire burn brighter, stronger, as it resonated with his will. And then, with a final, desperate cry, Ira had thrown the sword. This time, there was no hesitation, no doubt. The blade had left his hand in a blur of blue light, its trajectory straight and true, aimed directly at the dragon's heart. Zuhalu had seen the blade coming, had tried to twist away, but this time, he had been too slow. The Blaze Frost celestial sword had struck true, piercing through Zuhalu's neck with a force that sent shockwaves through the air. The dragon had let out a roar of pain, his massive body convulsing as the cold fire of the sword spread through his veins, freezing him from the inside out. The flames that had burned so fiercely within him had been extinguished in an instant, replaced by a chilling frost that encased his entire form. Zuhalu's wings had faltered, his flight path wavering as the cold overtook him. With a final, desperate cry, the dragon had crashed to the ground, his body shattering the earth beneath him as he fell. The impact had sent a shockwave through the battlefield, the ground trembling as the dragon's life force faded away. And then, all had been still. Ira had stood over the fallen dragon, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion. The Blazefrost celestial sword had returned to his hand, the blade's light dimming as the cold energy within it had been spent. He could feel the toll that the battle had taken on him, the strain of wielding such immense power weighing heavily on his mind and body. But he had done it. Zuhalu, the leader of the dragons, was dead, his body encased in a thick layer of ice that glittered in the pale light of the dying sun. The dragon's once mighty form was now nothing more than a frozen statue, a monument to the destructive power of the Blazefrost celestial sword. Yet, even as Ira stood victorious, he had known that the battle was far from over. The three remaining dragons, witnessing the fall of their leader, had let out roars of fear and fury. They had circled above the battlefield, their eyes filled with a mixture of rage and terror as they had seen Zuhalu's frozen corpse. But without their leader, the dragons had been lost. Their courage had faltered, their desire for vengeance overshadowed by the fear of meeting the same fate as Zuhalu. With a final, despairing cry, the three dragons had turned and fled, their wings beating furiously as they had retreated into the sky, disappearing into the distance. The battlefield had fallen silent, the only sound the distant crackle of dying flames and the soft hiss of steam rising from the frozen ground. The soldiers of both armies, who had watched the battle in stunned silence, had now turned their eyes to Ira, their expressions a mixture of awe and fear. Cyrus the Great, standing on the hill overlooking the battlefield, had watched as the last of the dragons had disappeared from sight. His face, usually so composed, had been twisted in a mask of anger and frustration. The dragons, the mighty beasts that he had hoped would bring him victory, had been defeated, their power broken by a single man. The realization had hit him like a physical blow. His army was in ruins, his dragons defeated, and his grand plan to conquer Babylon lay in tatters. As Cyrus had turned to his generals, his voice thick with frustration, he had demanded answers, demanded to know why the dragons had failed, why Ninmagus had not intervened to save the battle. But Ninmagus had only met his questions with a cold, distant gaze, her expression unreadable as she had offered no explanations, no excuses. "You must attack Babylon yourself," Cyrus had ordered, his voice filled with the desperation of a man who saw his empire slipping through his fingers. But Ninmagus had simply shaken her head. "I cannot," she had replied, her voice as cold and unyielding as the ice that had encased Zuhalu. "I cannot enter Babylon." Cyrus had stared at her, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. But before he could press her further, before he could demand the truth behind her words, the realization had dawned on him that there was nothing more to be done. The battle was lost, and the only choice left was to retreat, to regroup, and to plan for another day. "Order the retreat," Cyrus had commanded, his voice hollow with defeat. "We will return to our camp and regroup. This battle is lost, but the war is far from over." And so, with the sun setting on the ruins of Babylon, the Persian army began its slow, weary retreat. The soldiers, battered and demoralized, marched back across the scorched earth, their footsteps heavy with the weight of their defeat. The fires that had once raged so fiercely were now reduced to smoldering embers, and the distant roar of the dragons had faded into an eerie silence. The battlefield, once a place of chaos and bloodshed, was now a graveyard, a haunting reminder of the power that had been unleashed and the lives that had been lost. Ira watched as the Persian army withdrew, his eyes narrowed against the pain that still coursed through his body. The Blazefrost celestial sword hung limply at his side, its cold fire dimmed, but not extinguished. Every breath was a struggle, every movement a reminder of the flames that had seared his flesh, the burns that lay beneath the protective layer of ice that had saved him from certain death. But Ira knew that he could not afford to rest. Not yet. The city of Babylon was still vulnerable, its walls scarred and weakened by the dragon's attack, its people shaken and fearful. Cyrus might have been forced to retreat, but Ira knew that the Persian king would not give up so easily. There would be more battles to come, more trials to face, and Ira had to be ready. With a deep, steadying breath, Ira turned away from the retreating army and began to make his way back toward the city. His steps were slow, each one a painful reminder of the toll the battle had taken on him. The cold from the sword had seeped deep into his bones, numbing him to the core, and though he had grown accustomed to it, there was no denying the damage it had done. As he walked, his thoughts drifted back to the moments of the battle, to the 3 times he had thrown the Blazefrost celestial sword at Zuhalu. The first 2 attempts had been failures, the blade missing its mark, the dragon evading each strike with ease. But the 3rd time, when Ira had focused all his strength, all his will into the blade, it had finally struck true, piercing the dragon's neck and freezing him from within. He had won, but the victory had come at a great cost. The burns that marred his skin were a testament to the power of Zuhalu's flames, a reminder that even the Blazefrost celestial sword was not invincible. The layer of ice that had saved his life had also sealed in the pain, trapping the searing heat just beneath the surface of his skin. Each step he took sent a fresh wave of agony through his body, but Ira gritted his teeth and pushed forward. The streets of Babylon were eerily quiet as Ira entered the city. The people who had survived the battle had taken refuge in the remaining buildings, huddled together in fear and uncertainty. The once bustling markets were empty, the lively chatter of the citizens replaced by the hushed whispers of those who had witnessed the destruction firsthand. Ira moved through the desolate streets, his eyes scanning the faces of those who had gathered in the shadows. Some looked at him with awe, others with fear, and still others with a wary respect. They had seen what he was capable of, had watched as he had faced the dragons and emerged victorious. But they also knew that he was different, that the power he wielded came at a price that they were only beginning to understand. He reached the heart of the city, where the remnants of the Babylonian army had gathered. The soldiers who had survived the battle stood in solemn silence, their faces etched with exhaustion and sorrow. They had fought bravely, had given everything they had to defend their city, but the sight of their fallen comrades, the destruction that had been wrought upon their home, weighed heavily on their hearts. Nabonidus, the king of Babylon, stood at the center of the gathered soldiers, his expression grim as he surveyed the damage. When he saw Ira approaching, his eyes widened in a mixture of relief and concern. He stepped forward, his gaze taking in the burns that marred Ira's skin, the weariness in his eyes. "Ira," Nabonidus said, his voice heavy with the burden of leadership. "You've returned. Babylon owes you a great debt." Ira nodded, his voice hoarse from the smoke and the strain of the battle. "The dragons have fled, and Cyrus's army is in retreat. But the city is not safe, not yet." Nabonidus sighed, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his responsibilities. "I know. The walls are weakened, the people are terrified. And Cyrus, he will not stop. He will come again, and with him, more destruction." Ira glanced around at the soldiers, at the wounded and the dying, at the people who had lost everything in the battle. The burden of their lives weighed heavily on him, a responsibility he had taken upon himself. But even as the weight threatened to overwhelm him, there was a part of him that remained steadfast, that refused to give in to despair. "I will stand with you, Nabonidus," Ira said quietly. "As long as I draw breath, I will fight to protect Babylon. But we must prepare. Cyrus will return, and when he does, we must be ready." Nabonidus nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "You have the heart of a true warrior, Ira. But I fear that even your strength may not be enough to withstand what is to come." Ira met the king's gaze, his expression resolute. "We will find a way. Together." The king nodded once more, his eyes searching Ira's face as if seeking reassurance. "You are a beacon of hope for my people, Ira. But even the strongest beacon needs support. What you have done today, facing the dragons, is beyond anything we could have asked for. But I see the toll it has taken on you. Rest, if you can. You've earned it." Ira shook his head slowly. "There's no time to rest, Nabonidus. We need to reinforce the walls, tend to the wounded, and prepare for whatever comes next." Nabonidus looked like he wanted to argue, to insist that Ira take a moment for himself, but the grim reality of their situation weighed heavily on him. "Very well," the king said softly. "But know that your people, our people, are here for you as well. We will stand with you, just as you stand with us." Ira managed a small nod, though the weariness was beginning to weigh heavily on him. He felt the chill of the Blazefrost celestial sword deep in his bones, the cold fire that had become both his strength and his curse. He had grown accustomed to it, had learned to harness its power, but it was a power that came with a price that he was only beginning to understand. As Nabonidus turned to speak with his generals, issuing orders to begin the repairs and tend to the wounded, Ira found himself moving toward the remnants of the city's central square. The once proud structures that had stood as symbols of Babylon's might were now reduced to rubble, their stones blackened by the dragon's fire. The people who had survived the battle wandered through the wreckage, their faces blank with shock, their eyes haunted by the horrors they had witnessed. Ira paused at the edge of the square, his gaze drifting over the broken city. The Blazefrost celestial sword hung heavily at his side, its once brilliant light now a dull, cold glow. He could feel the weight of the weapon pulling at him, dragging him down, but he could not bring himself to let go of it. The sword was a part of him now, a part of his very being, and though it was a burden, it was also his only means of protecting those who could not protect themselves. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky was a deep, bruised purple, the first stars beginning to glimmer faintly in the fading light. The air was cooler now, the heat of the day giving way to the chill of the desert night. But even as the temperature dropped, Ira could still feel the lingering heat of the dragon's fire, the burns beneath the ice throbbing with a dull, constant pain. He stood there for a long time, his mind drifting through the events of the day, the battles he had fought, the lives he had taken, the destruction he had witnessed. The weight of it all pressed down on him, a burden that seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. But even as the pain and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, there was a part of him that remained resolute, that refused to give in. Ira knew that he could not afford to falter, could not afford to show weakness. The people of Babylon were depending on him, looking to him as their protector, their savior. And though the burden was great, though the toll it had taken on him was immense, he knew that he could not let them down. The silence of the heart. The night was a cloak of darkness, heavy and suffocating as it settled over Babylon. The stars, dim and distant, offered little comfort, their cold light swallowed by the shadows that clung to the city like a shroud. The ruins of the recent battle still smoldered, the last remnants of Dragonfire casting a faint, flickering glow over the streets. But in the heart of the city, where the temple stood, all was quiet, as if the very air held its breath in anticipation. Ira moved through the silent streets, his steps slow and deliberate, each one a battle against the pain that coursed through his body. The burns left by Zuhalu's flames were deep, searing reminders of the dragon's wrath, and though the Blazefrost celestial sword had protected him from the worst of it, the agony was still nearly unbearable. He had endured it in front of the people of Babylon, had stood tall and unwavering as they looked to him for strength. But now, in the solitude of the night, the mask of invincibility he had worn began to crack. He made his way toward the temple, the place where he had sought solace so many times before. It was a sanctuary, a refuge from the chaos of the world, and yet it was also the source of his deepest torment. For within those sacred walls dwelled Bel-Shaltinana, the woman who had captured his heart, the woman who remained forever beyond his reach. The temple loomed before him, its stone pillars rising like ancient sentinels against the night sky. The air was cool here, a gentle breeze whispering through the columns, carrying with it the faint scent of incense. The soft glow of oil lamps flickered from within, casting long shadows that danced across the marble floor. It was a place of peace, of worship, but for Ira, it was also a place of longing, of unspoken desires that gnawed at his soul. He pushed open the heavy doors, the sound echoing through the vast, empty space. The temple was quiet, the priests and priestesses having retired for the night, leaving only the soft murmur of prayers lingering in the air. But Ira knew that Bel-Shaltinana would be there, as she always was, her devotion to the gods keeping her in the temple long after others had gone. He moved through the dimly lit hallways, his footsteps soft on the cool stone. Each step was a reminder of the pain that lanced through his body, but he forced himself to keep moving, driven by a need he could not fully understand. It was not just the physical wounds that drew him here, but something deeper, something that had rooted itself in his heart long ago. As he approached the inner sanctum, he saw her, a solitary figure bathed in the golden light of the oil lamps. Belshazzar knelt before the altar, her hands clasped in prayer, her head bowed in reverence. Her long, dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face of serene beauty. She was still, almost statuesque, a living embodiment of the divine grace she served. Ira stopped at the threshold, unwilling to disturb the sacred moment. For a long time, he simply stood there, watching her, his heart aching with a longing that he could not voice. She was so close, and yet so far, an untouchable vision of purity and devotion. He had faced dragons, had wielded the power of the gods themselves, but in her presence, he felt small, unworthy of the love that he so desperately desired. Belshazzar, he whispered, his voice hoarse with pain and emotion. At the sound of her name, she lifted her head, her eyes slowly opening to meet his. They were the color of rich earth, deep and mysterious, holding within them the secrets of the world. For a moment, their gazes locked, and Ira felt as if the world had stopped, as if time itself had ceased to exist, leaving only the two of them in that sacred space. But then, as always, the moment passed. Belshazzar lowered her eyes, her expression unreadable, her silence a barrier that neither of them could breach. She did not speak, did not offer any words of comfort or greeting. She simply stood, her movements graceful and deliberate, as she turned away from the altar and began to walk toward him. Ira felt his heart clench as she approached, the pain of his wounds forgotten in the face of the anguish that her silence brought. He had faced death 1,000 times, had walked through the fires of battle and emerged unscathed, but this quiet, unspoken rejection was a torment that no weapon could defend against. He wanted to speak, to tell her of the battles he had fought, of the wounds he had endured, of the love that had grown in his heart despite the distance she maintained. But the words would not come. They were trapped in his throat, choked by the weight of his unspoken feelings. As she reached him, Ira felt his strength begin to falter. The pain, both physical and emotional, was too much to bear, and he could feel himself slipping, the edges of his vision darkening as the world began to tilt. He tried to steady himself, to remain standing, but his body betrayed him, the exhaustion finally taking its toll. Belshazzar. He whispered again, his voice barely audible as he collapsed to the floor, the darkness closing in around him. The last thing he saw before he lost consciousness was her face, her eyes filled with something he could not quite place, something that made his heart ache even more. The sanctuary of silence. When Ira awoke, he was lying on a soft bed, the scent of herbs and incense filling the air around him. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single oil lamp that flickered on a nearby table. The walls were draped in rich, dark fabrics, the colors muted and soothing, creating a sense of calm and tranquility. He blinked, disoriented, his body still aching from the burns that marred his skin. But as the haze of unconsciousness began to lift, he became aware of a presence beside him, a figure seated at the edge of the bed. Belshazzar. She was there, just as he had known she would be, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression calm and composed. But there was something different about her, something in the way she sat, the way her eyes lingered on his face, that made his heart skip a beat. Belshazzar. Ira murmured, his voice rough with the remnants of sleep. She did not respond, did not speak a single word. But her eyes, those deep, mysterious eyes, held a softness that he had never seen before, a tenderness that both comforted and unsettled him. He tried to sit up, but the pain in his body was too great, forcing him to lie back down with a soft groan. Belshazzar's hand moved slightly, as if she wanted to reach out to him, to offer some form of comfort, but she quickly withdrew, her fingers curling into her palm as if to restrain herself. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, thick with unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings. Ira could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, could feel the desperate need to break through it, to reach out to her, to bridge the gap that had always existed between them. But he knew that words would not suffice. Words had never been enough. Instead, he let his eyes speak for him, let them convey the emotions that he could not voice. He looked at her with a depth of feeling that he had never allowed himself to show before, his gaze intense and unwavering as he tried to convey everything that was in his heart. And for a moment, he thought he saw something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, of understanding. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by the same serene, unreadable expression that she always wore. Ira's heart sank, the hope that had briefly blossomed within him wilting in the face of her continued silence. He had known, deep down, that she would never return his feelings, that her devotion to the gods would always come before anything else. But still, a part of him had hoped, had longed for a different outcome. As if sensing his despair, Belshazzar finally moved. She reached for a small bowl of water that sat on the table beside the bed, her movements slow and deliberate as she dipped a cloth into the cool liquid. Without a word, she began to gently dab the cloth against the burns on Ira's skin, her touch soft and soothing. Ira closed his eyes, surrendering to the sensation, the coolness of the water a balm against the fiery pain that still lingered in his flesh. Her touch was so gentle, so careful, that it almost brought tears to his eyes. It was a kindness he had not expected, a tenderness that he had longed for but had never thought he would receive. But even as she tended to his wounds, even as her hands moved with the practiced grace of a healer, Belshazzar remained silent. Not a single word passed her lips, not a single sound escaped her throat. She worked in complete silence, her expression never wavering, her eyes never meeting his. Ira felt the weight of her silence like a stone in his chest, heavy and suffocating. He wanted to speak, to break through the barrier that separated them, but he knew that it would be futile. She had made her choice long ago, had chosen a life of devotion to the gods, a life that had no room for the love he so desperately wanted to give her. And yet, despite her silence, despite the wall that she had built around herself, Ira could not help but feel a connection to her, a bond that went beyond words, beyond the physical. It was as if their souls were intertwined, bound together by something deeper, something that neither of them fully understood. As Belshazzar continued to tend to his wounds, Ira let his mind drift, let his thoughts wander through the labyrinth of his emotions. He thought of the battles he had fought, the enemies he had faced, the blood that had been spilled in the name of a war that seemed to have no end. He thought of the lives he had taken, the souls that haunted his dreams, the faces of those who had fallen by his hand. But most of all, he thought of her, Belshazzar, the woman who had captured his heart, who had become the center of his world, even though she would never be his. "Why do you remain silent?" Ira whispered, his voice barely audible in the stillness of the room. "Why do you never speak to me? Do you not see the pain in my heart, the longing that consumes me?" Belshazzar did not respond, did not lift her eyes from the task at hand. But Ira could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands as she continued to tend to his wounds. It was a small, almost imperceptible sign, but it was enough to tell him that she had heard him, that his words had reached her. "I do not ask for much," Ira continued, his voice trembling with the weight of his emotions. "I do not ask for your love, for I know that it is not mine to have. But I ask for something, anything, to show me that I am not alone in this, that you see me, that you care." He waited, his heart pounding in his chest, the silence stretching on like a blade poised to strike. But still, Belshazzar did not speak, did not offer him the solace he so desperately sought. Ira closed his eyes, feeling the tears prick at the corners of his eyes, tears born of frustration, of sorrow, of a love that would never be returned. He had faced so many battles, had fought against forces that defied reason, but this silence, this unyielding barrier, was a battle he could not win. "I love you," Ira whispered, the words escaping him before he could stop them. "I love you more than I have ever loved anything in this world. But I know that you will never be mine." At his words, Belshazzar's hand stilled, the cloth falling from her fingers to land softly on the bed. For a moment, Ira thought he saw her lips part, as if she were about to speak, as if she were finally going to break her silence. But then, just as quickly, her lips pressed together, and she turned her face away, her eyes closing as if to block out the sight of him. A single tear slipped down Ira's cheek, a tear of loss, of resignation. He had known, deep down, that this was how it would be, that no matter how much he loved her, no matter how much he wished for a different outcome, she would never be his. But even in the face of that truth, even as the weight of it pressed down on him, he could not bring himself to hate her, to resent her for the choice she had made. For in her silence, in her devotion to the gods, she was still the woman he loved, the woman who had given him a reason to fight, a reason to live. As the night wore on, as the oil lamp flickered and sputtered, Ira's strength began to wane. The exhaustion that had been kept at bay by sheer willpower finally began to overtake him, his eyelids growing heavy, his body sinking into the soft bed. The pain of his wounds, the ache in his heart, all began to fade as sleep claimed him, pulling him down into the depths of unconsciousness. And as he drifted into the darkness, he heard her voice, soft, barely more than a whisper, but there, unmistakable. Ira. It was the first time she had ever spoken his name. In his sleep, a faint smile touched Ira's lips, and the last thing he saw before the darkness took him completely was the image of Bel-Shaltinana, her face framed by the soft glow of the lamp, her eyes filled with tears. The blooming of a silent love. When Ira awoke, the room was bathed in the pale light of dawn. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the small window, casting a warm, golden glow over the chamber. The scent of herbs still lingered in the air, and the soft rustle of fabric told him that someone was nearby. He turned his head slightly and saw Bel-Shaltinana seated beside the bed, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed in what appeared to be silent prayer. The oil lamp had burned out, leaving only the soft light of the morning to illuminate the room. Ira's heart swelled with a mixture of emotions as he looked at her, the memory of the previous night flooding back to him. The pain, the longing, the words he had spoken in the darkness, all of it was still fresh in his mind, as sharp and real as the burns on his skin. But as he looked at Bel-Shaltinana, he saw something different in her, a softness, a vulnerability that he had never seen before. Her face, usually so composed, so serene, was marked by the faint traces of tears, her eyes rimmed with a redness that spoke of a night spent in silent sorrow. She must have sensed his gaze, for she slowly opened her eyes and looked at him. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, neither speaking, neither moving. But in that silence, in the space between them, something had changed, something unspoken, but deeply felt. Bel-Shaltinana's lips parted as if to speak, but once again, the words did not come. Instead, she simply reached out and took his hand in hers, her fingers cool and smooth against his skin. It was a simple gesture, but one that carried with it all the emotions that she could not voice, all the love that she had kept hidden away for so long. Ira's heart pounded in his chest as he felt the warmth of her touch, the connection that had always existed between them finally brought to the surface. It was a moment of pure, unspoken understanding, a moment that needed no words. He wanted to tell her how much this meant to him, how much her touch, her presence, had brought him comfort in a world that was so often filled with pain and loss. But he knew that no words could capture the depth of what he felt, that this was something that could only be shared in the silence between them. As the first light of day continued to fill the room, Ira squeezed her hand gently, a silent promise that he would carry with him into whatever battles lay ahead. He had always known that his love for her would remain unspoken, but now, in this quiet moment, he understood that it did not need to be spoken to be real, to be true. Bel-Shaltinana remained silent, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness, but also with something more, something that told him that, in her own way, she loved him too. And as Ira lay there, his hand in hers, he felt a sense of peace that he had not known in a long time, a peace that came from the knowledge that, even in a world filled with darkness and despair, there was still a place for love, a place for hope. The war was not over. The battles were far from won. But in this moment, in this silent, sacred space, Ira knew that he had found something worth fighting for, something that would give him the strength to face whatever came next. For as long as Bel-Shaltinana was there, as long as her love, silent though it may be, was there to guide him, Ira knew that he could endure anything. And in that knowledge, in that quiet, unspoken understanding, Ira found the courage to rise, to stand once more, and to face the dawn of a new day.